And I'm now delighted to introduce Dr. Danielle Resnick. So Danielle is a senior research fellow in the Development Strategies and Governance Unit at the International Food Policy Research Institute. She is also a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution in the Global Economy and Development Program. So great, important links there. And really, Danielle's main area of research includes political economy of agricultural and nutrition policy, food systems, decentralization, urban governance, and informal traders. And she has particular regional expertise in sub-Saharan Africa. Danielle has published in numerous peer-reviewed journal articles, and you can catch up on all of those, but she's co-authored a number of different books as well. And the one that she'll be talking to us about tonight is her hot off the press, The Political Economy of Food System Transformation, Pathways to Progress in a Polarized World. And really, this is very hot off the press. It was published in November last year. So we're really delighted that you could join us. Thanks tonight, Danielle, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Christina, for the kind introduction and for the invitation to be part of your Food Thinkers webinar series. As Christina noted, this is a highly topical issue. For many of you based in Europe, obviously the past week we've seen a large number of protests in different capital cities over different types of environmental policies that farmers feel are threatening their livelihoods. Earlier this week, the Food System Economic Commission launched their report that talked about some of the major costs to the food system and to our health and to the environment, and highlighting different opportunities for reforming the food system. So I think it's extremely topical, both in terms of the needs to try to fix the food system, to make it more sustainable, but also the difficult politics that we're going to need to confront to make that a reality. So I'm really happy to talk about our co-edited book. As Christina mentioned, it was published in November of 2023. It's open access and freely downloadable from both the Oxford University Press site and also from IFPRI's website. So I want to start off by highlighting that any type of co-edited book is really a collaborative effort. And we were extremely fortunate to have a team of multidisciplinary scholars using a diverse range of methodologies spanning economics, political science, public policy, geography, sociology, even psychology, and providing us with case studies from around the world. So we really do have a kind of global focus with our cases. We also span a variety of different policy issues that I think are quite topical today. Things such as how do you repurpose subsidies? How do you encourage biotechnology uptake and deal with real serious concerns about the health or environmental implications of certain biotechnology innovations? The utility and uptake of sugar-sweetened beverage taxes, or addressing declines or trying to encourage declines in red meat consumption. And then we have some, focused regional analyses looking at some of the challenges with the European Union's farm-to-fork strategy, or the adoption of urban food policy councils in sub-Saharan Africa. And then looking at some of the accountability and political economy issues around the UN Food Systems Summit, and how do you keep governments accountable for what they said they might do at that summit. So a real range of topics that we look at. And I think our starting point in this book is really, as is increasingly accepted, that the current food system, or particularly the global food system, is not sustainable for our health, for environmental reasons, even for livelihoods and job issues. So we're kind of agreed that something needs to change. But of course, it's really about the political economy of how you're going to get that change. So I'm going to start off by talking about 4 reasons why this is a politically contested area. Then I'm going to present the framework that we use in the book to highlight when there are opportunities for change, and that draws on collective experiences from the book. And then I'll conclude with some broader lessons and where we see future research could happen in this area. So I think one of the first reasons why reforms in this area are so difficult is because, the food systems agenda has become incredibly complex. We've started using this term food systems for, the last 5 to 10 years. But the boundaries of the food system are also contested. We may see the boundaries in different ways, depending on our own disciplinary backgrounds. And because it's become so complex, we're not just talking about, producers versus consumers. And that was typically the framework we used as political economists when we were looking at, who are winners and losers from different types of agricultural policy reforms, for instance. Now we have a much more complex, variegated array of actors. We have banking companies, we have insurance companies, we even have mining companies that are involved in fertilizer. So we have a variety of interest actors and coalitions. And so it's sometimes hard to see ex ante who are going to be the winners and losers of different types of reforms and what types of coalitions are they going to enter into. It's also, as we know, a multi-sectoral agenda. And this really creates, I think, a lot of challenges from a bureaucratic and public sector governance perspective. I can count on one hand globally the number of countries that have ministries of food, right? There's very few countries that do have this. And so what is the government entity that's really supposed to be leading our thinking on food systems, or what types of mechanisms are there in order to encourage this kind of multi-sectoral policy implementation? And, obviously real trade-offs for policymakers in terms of pursuing this agenda. I present on the right-hand side 2 pictures, both coming from South Africa. Now, the top one is reflective of quite an active social movement that was pushing for a sugar-sweetened beverage tax, and of course, highlighting the incidence of non-communicable diseases and diabetes. And they were really supported by the Ministry of Health, and they did pass a health levy on sugar-sweetened beverage taxes. But then you saw a kind of counter protest, particularly from those working in the sugar industry, and being concerned about how is this type of a tax going to affect sugar industry jobs. And so you saw the Ministry of Trade and Industry then trying to create a sugar master industrial plan to protect the sugar industry. And so, of course, people have different values, they have different priorities, and what they're interested in really highlighting in their policy interventions. And on top of this, we've had, a pretty massive push towards decentralization over actually the last 15 or so years. In many countries, we now have responsibilities over health, over agricultural, particularly agricultural extension, delegated to subnational entities. And we also are seeing a lot of interest and really progress on food systems reforms coming from mayors and coming from cities. So there's a real kind of a vertical coordination dimension to pushing forward coherent food system policies. I think a second reason why these reforms are so difficult is because we're expecting a lot from our food systems now. We're not just expecting them to provide calories or even nutrients, but we're expecting them to address climate issues, to make sure they're not violating food sovereignty, to uphold racial and gender equality, and of course, ensuring different types of human rights. And so, we've been seeing this from different types of rallies around the world, really, that relate to the food system. Just as we've seen some of the tractors rolling into European capitals over the past week with farmers concerned about climate policies and their impact on their livelihoods. Last year in Washington, D.C., we had farmers lobbying for, more effective climate action and racial justice being a focus for reforms to the U.S. Farm Bill. On the bottom part of your screen, you see a protest movement in Kenya. And I think what's really interesting from this picture is that it's a peasant farmers organization, and they're pushing for food sovereignty, but they're also highlighting that they're feminist peasants, and that they're also wanting to push towards ending SGBV, which means sexual gender-based violence. So there's a whole range of objectives that are really kind of embedded in what we're ascribing to our food systems. And some of that has been, exacerbated by the growth in transnational activism that we see today that really uses different types of frames to mobilize very different constituencies, and it shifts very dramatically our traditional thinking about how agricultural or food policy lobbying occurs. Now, third, I think just as our food systems have been changing, our political systems have changed dramatically over the last decade. We've had a growth in populism, in a liberal democracy, a lot of political polarization, and I think notably a lot of partisan de-alignment. So where you might have had traditional constituencies being aligned with institutionalized political parties, those constituencies are no longer finding that those parties are meaningful or representing their interests in the political sphere. So, I think most notably, we saw the rise of the BBB movement in the Netherlands just last year. That got a lot of support from pushing against some of the green policies that the Dutch government had. And of course, as we're seeing in many domains of our lives, the growth of misinformation, increased bias, and I think particularly in these more kind of populist policy systems, a denigration of evidence-based policymaking, and leading to kind of villainization of those who don't ascribe to our viewpoints, using terms like you're a health elite or it's a nanny state if you're trying to be pushing towards reducing red meat consumption or adopting sugar-sweetened beverage taxes. The picture on the bottom side of your screen is actually set in Canada, but the protesters are holding Dutch flags, so they're showing their support for the kind of the Dutch farmer movement. And the sign in the front highlights you need to question both the science and the politics and the money. So kind of ascribing that there's kind of some kind of grand conspiracy, amongst those who are pushing evidence-based policy making, and claiming that there's something conspiracy related to some of our policy making and thinking about what makes a healthy food system. And then we're also seeing, a growth in boycotts and boycotts linked to political views. CEOs of food companies who may have particular partisanship have been targeted by opponents, but then also for supporters for political party, you're seeing kind of a growth in purchases for those food products. So I think it's a very interesting time for food policy because it's not just thinking about how our food systems need to change, but also how our political systems need to change. And lastly, the polarization that we're seeing at the national level is certainly being reflected at the international level. We're really seeing, I think, a lot of demoralization about the future of multilateralism. We continue to see, a lot of stalling within the World Trade Organization over agricultural policy. The U.S. continues to stall on appointing people to the appellate court to ensure different sanctions can be upheld in the WTO. We've seen this week, even at the regional level, we've seen Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali wanting to pull out of the Economic Organization of West African States in West Africa, which is a traditional regional economic trading body. So we're seeing a lot of concern about, is multilateralism the way in which we're going to make policy in the future? And that really affects the challenge of global governance of food systems. And related to that, we're seeing a lot of decisions around the food system actually coming now through different types of economic clubs or bodies like the G20, like BRICS, where there's a push for, maybe reinventing what our multilateral system is looking like. And at the same time, with this kind of disappointment with multilateralism, we're seeing a rise in multi-stakeholderism. So having convenings that really are intended to bring different stakeholders' views into the policy sphere, notwithstanding their own challenges of multi-stakeholder platforms. But the one challenge I think I see with these multi-stakeholder events is while they're increasing inclusivity, they're not really obligating any type of intergovernmental action or accountability on decision making. And this has been one of the concerns coming out of the UN Food Systems Summit. So given these four kind of challenges that we're seeing and the different dimensions of polarization, in our book, we've tried to present a framework for food system reforms that's really quite inductive. This means it's really coming out from looking across the 13 or so chapters and case studies that we have in the book and seeing what are key commonalities that have been either binding constraints or drivers to greater reform on food system issues. So I'm going to talk through a little bit about the framework, and then I'll draw out some common lessons based on this framework. So on the upper left-hand side of your screen, you see the incentive structures for reforms. And this is our common political economy thinking about how policymaking is done. And it really involves thinking about what are the costs and benefits of different policy instruments, because of course that leads you to think about who are the winners and losers of different types of reforms. But we also add to this the salience of policy instruments. Because we know certain policy issues are going to resonate more with the public than others. Taxes are something that really resonates with the public because they can think immediately about how is this going to affect my pocketbook. But it's much harder to think about maybe how regulatory reform is going to affect you personally. So we think kind of not just think about costs and benefits, but also the salience of the policy gets you to think about, well, who's going to actually be a winner, a loser, or kind of come out on the streets, for or against a particular policy. And how you interpret those costs and benefits and salience really depends on whether you're more motivated by interests or ideas. So, interests, we're thinking about material interest in particular. Are you motivated by profit? Are you motivated by prices? Or are you more motivated by different ideas and ideologies? Ideas about nationalism, sovereignty, food self-sufficiency, even issues about how much we place on known risks versus unknown risks. And this is a real challenge in the area of biotechnology. And then how those different interests and ideas are filtered is really mediated by institutions. These can be our multilateral institutions, they can be political institutions, and they can also be kind of organizational institutions like farmers associations, consumer groups, et cetera. So thinking through the incentive structures for reform really gives you a sense of who has power and agency vis-a-vis a particular reform discussion. And then that gives you a sense of who is going to mobilize either for or against a particular type of reform. And so that brings us to our second box that you see on the upper right-hand side of your screen, looking at mobilization. And here throughout the book, what we're really finding is, coalitions are so central to understanding where we're getting momentum or where we're continuing to see policy inertia. So these coalitions can be coming from groups that share the same, they share the same policy beliefs and they share the same policy instrument that they want to see. But there's other cases where you have strange bedfellow coalitions where they may share, they want to see the same policy instrument being adopted, but for very different reasons. So there's lots of different interesting examples of those types of coalitions in the book. Coalitions then can mobilize information in very different ways. Obviously, they can mobilize it in ways that biases the policy agenda towards their own aims, but they can also be, using, scientific research and from the research community in order to push forward their different views. And how this is done, the tactics that are used are really key, because in some cases, you may, as a coalition or as some type of advocacy organization, be using tactics that are quite confrontational. Maybe taking your tractor out to the street, but you can also have much more consensual approaches. And we have some examples from Ireland, for instance, where you have these constituent assemblies that try to come together and discuss through dialogue how to progress on some of these sticky issues. So those types of coalitions, information, and tactics really define how contentious, how polarizing we want to make an issue. And by the same token, what are the opportunities for consensus and negotiation? And that helps us to think about how we need to design politically viable options. If we have a really kind of polarized context with lots of different interest groups, we have to be even more savvy in how we design our policies. And so in the book, there's quite a few examples of how you may engage in bundling of different types of policies that fit into different spheres. Maybe you need to be thinking about institutional reforms, in addition to maybe legal reforms and tax reforms, market liberalization reforms, or how those need to be bundled together, but also policy packaging. So maybe if you're looking at one unique issue, like reducing red meat consumption, how can you maybe bundle together or package different types of options to the public so that they say, okay, this is something that I'll buy into. So I'll show you an example in a minute, but you may be bringing together maybe information campaigns, certain subsidy approaches, other types of tax incentives. And so the intention is really to create kind of win-win options. No one gets everything they want, but everyone gets something that they want. And that's kind of a way to try to get momentum. We also look at sequencing and how sequencing really helps you better understand why we see progress on certain domains in some countries and not in others. We have some really interesting work showing why we've seen progress on biotechnology adoption in some regions and not others, and how that was sequenced. And the issue with sequencing is if you do something really well at the outset, you can really get momentum for subsequent processes. But if you really do poorly at the outset with the first type of reform in the sequence, that you can really derail the entire reform process. So these dimensions of bundling, packaging, and sequencing, they have their advantages in terms of broadening who's on board, but they can also create path dependencies, because anytime you want to change something, now you have to get the same set of stakeholders on board, or you have to be very careful about the way in which you sequence those reforms. And so that brings us to our last part of our framework on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, where we think about adaptation of food system policies, because we know we do see change in food systems. And so where does that come from? Sometimes it comes from critical junctures, a crisis, of course, COVID. If we think about the various geopolitical crises, how that's shifted different policy priorities. It can come from a food safety crisis, and that's seen to have, be a genesis for different views on GMOs in different parts of the world, where there has been a food safety crisis that has undermined public trust. It could be a fiscal crisis, and actually a lot of countries, when they've taken up sugar-sweetened beverage taxes, has actually been in the wake of a fiscal crisis, and it's been seen as a way of raising money. Or the rise of green parties in the European Union, which really pushed forward through things like the Green New Deal. In addition to critical junctures, we also have policy diffusion. How something that seems really innovative and works in one setting is taken up in a number of countries. And so you've really seen a spread of a number of different policy options, like sugar-sweetened or ultra-processed taxes, like food policy councils or multi-stakeholder platforms. These have gotten traction in certain areas of the world, and then they've spread through policy diffusion techniques. And then finally, we look at cascades, and this is just kind of another viewpoint on diffusion. When we think of kind of cascades of water, it's something that's coming on high and trickles down. And similarly in the policy sphere, if you're thinking about cascades, you're thinking about a kind of a policy that's decided maybe at the supranational level, and then all kind of nation states that are part of that supranational body buy into it. So you can think about in Africa, the African Union's CAADP program. That's really kind of pushed African states that are part of it to really target different investments for the agricultural sector. You can think about the European Union's farm to fork strategy, or even the UN with pushing the food systems agenda through the UN Food Systems Summit. So let me now just turn to some kind of broader lessons from the book that are coming out from that framework and the broad set of cases that we have. So I think the first lesson from the book is that this challenge with trade-offs is really much more difficult to reconcile if you're dealing with trade-offs between two values, which is considered a tragic trade-off, versus whether you're dealing with a conflict between two interests, which is considered a routine trade-off. So you can think about something like sugar-sweetened beverage taxes. In general, this is really a conflict among interest groups around material interests, right? So can you get companies to buy in being taxed, and then potentially having some compensation options for them? So you basically finding ways where you can buy off opponents in a way through some type of compensatory measure. But that's very different if you're trying to push something like genetically modified organisms, which people really can really feel very personal about. Some, as the diagram on the right-hand side is seeing, is really concerned about what this means for food sovereignty. On the other hand, others think, this is really one of the few options if we want to deal with climate change mitigation, or we want to enhance, agricultural productivity. And so, in both cases, it's actually, about the value people ascribe to known risks and unknown risks. And things that they feel quite passionate about. So it's not just about buying off losers. You have to really get at their values, and that's much harder to do. Secondly, as I noted earlier, coalitions are really key for a lot of these reforms, and they can be very powerful. They can also come from unexpected quarters, but they can fracture or calcify. When you have these strange bedfellow coalitions, when you have groups that come together that may be supporting the same policy instrument, but for different reasons. A great example of this is in the US with our US Farm Bill. So this provides a lot of subsidies for rural farmers. And so there's a lot of support for this from particularly more conservative Republican politicians who are representing rural constituencies, and particularly farming communities. But within this bill, it also embeds our Supplemental Nutrition Act, which provides food support for low-income families. And so it's quite popular as well among urban, tending to be more democratic politicians as well. So even though there's a lot of problems with the Farm Bill, the way subsidies are designed, it's very hard to get momentum on that because, you've built a coalition. You've done this kind of savvy policy design that I talked about in the previous screen, but now it's quite hard to unravel that because you created something for both groups, and neither wants to give that up. And we're also seeing, when we look kind of transnationally, that transnational coalitions, whether it's on sugar-sweetened beverage taxes or in other areas, they really offer resources and visibility to local social movements. But sometimes they can undermine kind of domestic ownership of issues because they're bringing in a frame that's actually not exactly what the local civil society movement was pushing. And so we have a really great chapter in the book on Zambia, and it's talking about how transnational activists tried to come in and kind of shift thinking about food subsidies, and particularly input subsidies that the Zambian governments had, and trying to say, well, these are not good for stunting. You're supporting a system of cereals-based production through these input subsidies that's not really tackling micronutrient deficiencies. So they came in with this kind of stunting angle, which didn't quite resonate with what local civil society groups were pushing for in their own efforts to reform the subsidy program. Third, as noted earlier, you can have this kind of interesting momentum on policy through strategic design and savvy framing. And I'm giving this example on the right from Lucas Fessenfeld and colleagues. They have a great chapter in the book on this. They also have several other papers on this, where they're looking at policy packaging to reduce red meat consumption. So they kind of show across survey work they've done in Germany, China, and USA, that you can get more than half of at least their survey respondents to be supporting a reduction in red meat consumption through a packaging of a bunch of different options. So they may buy into this if you're saying that you'll have to increase taxes on meat. The revenue from those increased taxes will go for low-income houses. There'll be frequent information campaigns, et cetera. So it's about offering the public a variety of options that they say, okay, in that particular scenario of packaging, I would be compelled to reduce my red meat consumption. Similarly, Chris Barrett has a great chapter in the book that looks at biotechnology uptake, and he uses this case of Bt brinjal adoption in Bangladesh and India. The development of Bt brinjal was originally meant for India, but because of very active social movement there that was against kind of GM production, as well as disagreements among ministries, it never took off. But by contrast, in Bangladesh, you didn't have as visible or vocal social movement against this. And you also found alignment between ministries of environment, finance, and agriculture, who all saw different benefits from the adoption of Bt brinjal. So showing the alignment, how you can get the alignment of different actors for these policy reforms. Fourth, we find that particularly when you're looking at policy diffusion, the adaptation or implementation of different policy options really needs to be matched with the administrative capacities on the ground. And we really need to kind of avoid what some call isomorphic mimicry, where you just you mimic the kind of outward trappings of a particular policy, but you don't really have the institutional setup to implement it in the way that it's supposed to be implemented for the local setting. So there's quite a number of examples of this in the book, but I think one of the most salient is a chapter by colleagues at the Africa Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town, and they look at the kind of adoption or the importation of urban food policy councils in sub-Saharan Africa, and why those haven't always worked as in the same way that you've seen them work in maybe North America or Latin America, and particularly because of kind of the low levels of actual fiscal and administrative decentralization that urban authorities have in the African context. And I think finally, and this is kind of one of our major takeaways from the book, is trying to avoid a food superheroes versus villains dichotomy in some of our discussions on the food systems, and trying to avoid ascribing kind of normative motivations to different stakeholder categories. We sometimes tend to see all civil society as good. We tend to see corporate industry as bad. And of course, that's just a kind of an artificial dichotomy. There's a lot of nuance to all the actors in the food system, and of course, even a lot of nuance to the public sector, which is not a monolith and has a lot of variation across ministries and between national and subnational entities. So let me just conclude by talking about some kind of broader kind of research areas. Obviously, one book's not going to cover all the issues, political economy issues that are relevant to the food system, and there's many more that can be explored. Three that we think are really key for getting more momentum on policy is one about how do you generate citizen trust in governments for reforms. And I think this is particularly relevant when we're thinking about intertemporal reforms. So something like repurposing agricultural subsidies. We know my colleagues at IFPRI, the World Bank, FAO, have been highlighting that we have $800 billion being spent on agricultural subsidies and other support measures, and that could be better used for targeted investments in agricultural research and technology. But the challenge is, how do you get citizens to kind of buy in to the fact that, okay, they're willing to maybe give up, particularly farming communities, maybe giving up certain subsidies in the short term in the expectation that there will be better returns in the long run. It's kind of a leap of faith that everything that's assumed in some of our modeling scenarios is actually going to happen on the ground. So how do you kind of generate that citizen trust in some of these reforms? Secondly, how do you build politically influential constituencies for low visibility reforms? And again, this comes back to something like agricultural research and development. We know it's woefully underinvested in, particularly in low income countries. So how can we kind of generate constituencies that support this? Because typically, and particularly in democracies, people are more likely to support something tangible, visible that they can have today, like a subsidy, like a healthcare clinic, a school, a road, and not necessarily something where the benefit's going to come in maybe 10 years or 15 years, and which you can't directly maybe attribute to the government. It could be, the agricultural productivity, for instance, is influenced by a lot of factors beyond just government action. And then lastly, I think there's a lot of scope in this area for looking at the intersection between domestic and international political economy, looking at these kind of two-level games, what we call it in political economy, where kind of decisions that are made at the global level, how do those then filter down at the national level and take into account different ministerial preferences and different kind of voting constituencies. So one example of this is, the European Union's proposed farm to fork strategy is actually going to have quite significant impacts on certain African countries that have major export markets to the EU, particularly South Africa, but also Kenya. So kind of tracing through, how these policies that are intended for one region, the externalities and the political economy dynamics that they're going to generate in regions that they weren't originally intended to affect. So if you are interested in kind of getting more details from the book, again, it's freely downloadable from the IFPRI website. We also have a short synopsis piece, if you just want to get to the heart of the matter, that appeared in Nature Food in December of this year. So with that, I'm going to end and hand back to you, Christina.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much, Danielle. What a fantastic overview of your book, and a huge amount of work that's gone into that, and lots of lessons for us all. We've got lots of interest online and lots of people complimenting what an excellent presentation that was. So thank you very much. I've personally learned a lot and have quite a number of questions as well, but we'll start with one from Stuart Gillespie. He said, "Great presentation, Danielle. There are so many reports now on food systems transformation that don't really refer to transformation at all, because they completely fail to acknowledge the massive power imbalances in the food system and in politics of large-scale systemic change. So where there are winners and losers, do you think that this is a problem?"
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we've struggled to define, I think, as a research community and those who are practitioners in this space, what the boundaries of the food system are, but also what we mean by transformation. I think one of the issues that we even talk about as kind of a caveat at the end of our book is we personally don't know about what are the set of interlinked policies that you need to get to transformation, because we tend to still work in our own domains. We may still be in nutrition and health, in agricultural economy, in climate. So we're thinking about policies that are going to move the needle in each of those domains, but we can't really see the full 360-degree perspective on how you're going to get momentum in all these domains, without having significant externalities, negative externalities on each of them. And I think related to that is not having a full perspective on the range of power, interests, and politics across all these domains. Because while you may be thinking about kind of corporate industries dominating, health and the food sector, we equally have those that are involved dominating, inputs, seeds, fertilizer, and even, in the finance system, a lot of discussion about how we have to deal with power asymmetries, sovereign rating agencies, and how they're affecting debt distress and the ability for African governments to invest in their food systems. So, I think kind of the global governance of the food system is really deserving of much more attention. But it does require us, I think, as a community to be clear about what we even mean by what would that transformation look like. And whose incentives do we need to change collectively to get that moving forward?
It's not a small challenge, is it? It's interesting. One of the questions that I had is about that siloed nature, and how actually at a certain level and at a higher level, sometimes it's better, you've got more scope to be able to interlink between, you talked about ministries and not many countries having ministries of food, which would actually by nature sort of break down those silos, and what aspects there are and avenues there are. The value point that you raised as being sort of one of those challenges for trade-offs, I thought was really interesting. And how do we overcome values, and is that part of breaking down silos, and does language have anything to do with that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think language is at the core of it. I mean, how you can, just kind of shift the values that you're targeting with your framing. That's something that the chapter I was alluding to on the red meat consumption was talking about. So they did a variety of what are called conjoint experiments, and they found that, you get kind of resistance from people if you frame it as, red meat, decreasing your red meat consumption. But then you get more people kind of willing to buy into this idea if you shift it and talking about increasing animal welfare. And so it's about kind of finding what's important to people and being able to shift the narrative and framing in a way so that it resonates more with them. I think that's a little bit different than some of the challenges that we see in government, where I think at the end of the day, they have some concrete issues about not wanting to alienate certain constituents that may be aligned, key for their ministry. And there's also obviously kind of interministerial jealousies that can come about when even talking about the food system, and is that taking away autonomy from the Ministry of Agriculture, for instance, over this area. So I think it's actually a more feasible issue to address because it's kind of a public sector governance issue, and you could think of presidential delivery systems or other types of ways that you can have performance contracts or delivery performance indicators that all the ministries can buy into. But I think the values issue that you brought up really requires working more with kind of communication experts about how you tap in, get the narrative right to tap into people's core values, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Thank you. So we have another question from Francois Steckman. He said, what are the politically viable options to overcome risk adversity to embrace innovation? And he's talking about farmers and investment bankers, for example.
Can you repeat the question? What other options are there for?
So what are the politically viable options to overcome risk adversity to embrace innovation?
Well, I don't have some concrete examples beyond some of them that are highlighted in the book. Again, I refer you to Chris Barrett's chapter where, besides the brinjal example I gave, he talked about China's agricultural backyard programs. He has a few examples from the US. But I think this issue about kind of risk really again relates to that bigger issue of trust, right? Are farmers going to kind of are they willing to take the risk in knowing that they're going to be compensated in some way, or that they're going to have a safety net in some way if they take that risk? So it may be about thinking about certain types of social protection systems that can be put in place if farmers are going to be experimenting with new biotechnology options that don't have the payoff that was expected. There might be certain kind of incentive schemes that you see, like maybe you provide farmers with some type of kind of a upfront payment to get them to try to experiment with something. So there's maybe not really, at the end of the day, net wise, a huge kind of financial loss to them. But something to show good faith that you're not just expecting farmers to do something and that they're out on their own, that they've got some type of cushion from the public sector.
Yeah, and what speaks to me is that box about how to design viable policy options. What we're talking about, bundling and sequencing, and that's kind of saying it's not just one policy without recognizing the impact that might have, and so you're sequencing a range of policies. Yeah, I thought that was a really neat framework. So the next question is from Eric Millstone. Would you agree that one way of building trust in government reforms is by undermining trust in status quo policies?
That's interesting. I think undermining trust in status quo policies. Yeah, I mean, I think showing obviously kind of showing why the status quo is not working for the particular constituency that you're trying to motivate to change, I think is one way to show it. But you'd have to be careful that that you're not showing that the status quo is is being driven by the government, right? I mean, that you have to be able to show that, as I was saying in my previous answer, that there's kind of good faith on the government to change something. Of course, not everything's driven by the public sector, but I think in a lot of these spaces of the food system, it is kind of creating the enabling environment, for better or worse. So I think, about how you can, consider ways that you create this types of faith that something differently is going to be done is really key. And part of that is not just about providing some type of compensation, but it's also the way in which governments go about that. And I had put up the picture of the Indian farmer protest from last year and from 2 years ago. And one of the kind of issues beyond this protest was that there wasn't any consultation with the farmers who were going to be affected. The Modi government put these 3 farm acts into place very quickly with hardly any consultation. And that's really, I think, what precipitated those protests, that it was seen as a fait accompli. So it's not often just having some type of compensation or showing something that directly on the ground is going to change, but the process in which governments engage with the stakeholders who are going to be most affected. And to be fair, a lot of the kind of commentary I've heard about the protests we're seeing in Europe have been generated by the same sense of marginalization, or a sense that the voice has not been taken into account in making these policies.
Great, thank you. So there's a question from an anonymous attendee. Can you suggest a practical issue or project that different parties can come together to work on right now that will likely succeed and make a real difference to food system transformation?
Well, that's a fantastic question. Well, I'm going to give you a kind of very concrete example. I mean, we're trying at IFPRI, trying to concretely get at what has already been committed to by governments, particularly in global convenings over the last 10 years or so since the SDGs were started. And trying to actually bring stakeholders together, including advocacy groups, to look at these different commitments that were made and now try to track them, because there's no kind of accountability for some of these statements that are made to tackle hunger and malnutrition, particularly SDG 2. So I think through that effort, our intention is to actually provide a public good and providing kind of a database of this is what different governments said they would do, which ones actually did them, and then go one step further. If they didn't do it, why not? And I think that can be actually a consultative process. It doesn't need to be naming and shaming governments. There can be concrete reasons. The political administration changed. There was a financial shortfall. There was ministerial turnover. So trying to kind of bring through in various different fora, we're actually having one at IFPRI next week, to discuss why can't we actually get implementation on the ground. So it's not on a particular, project, which the questioner may be looking for, but I think it's really on the process, why we commit to transformation, to SDGs, et cetera, and then why we may not get the implementation. What do we need to be learning from each other about the shortfalls in our efforts to make progress in these domains?
Absolutely. Great, thank you. The next question from Maria Hortab Piera. It says, how do you deal with the fragmentation of policies in urban and rural contexts, and that these really are creating social and spatial injustice between and across these different rural and urban areas, and that as a result, both areas are suffering several threats?
Well, first, I mean, I think that's an empirical question about if that's happening and where that's happening most. But I think one of the issues is you do have, often, as I was saying earlier, very proactive, maybe mayors in some settings who are pushing forward on urban food systems change. Urban settings tend to have a lot more resources, whether own source revenue or from intergovernmental sources. And so they do have the ability to maybe, create more action in this space than you would see in rural areas. And so I mean, I think in that regard, that's where you can have the inequality that the questioner was noting to. Now, how to mitigate that? Well, I mean, I think you have a lot of spatial differentiation across countries, including the responsibilities that rural authorities are given. Sometimes they're given much more circumscribed authority. At least this is in the case in Africa, where I know best. So thinking through, are there kind of functional responsibilities that you could be allocating more to rural subnational governments for them to have a greater say in policies related to food, nutrition, et cetera? And are there ways to maybe shift financing rules, intergovernmental transfer rules to give greater money to more disadvantaged, more marginalized remote rural areas, so that local authorities can engage more on these food system issues?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely great. We've got a question now from Samuel. Forgive me, Samuel, I will mispronounce your name. Olu Famio. And he said, what would you say are the important structures to put in place for operationalizing the framework of African systems in the African context? So he's talking about, sorry, not your framework, in the African context. So what specific So let me repeat that. What would you say are the important structures to put in place for operationalizing your framework in the African context?
So it's an analytical framework. So it's not something that I think can be kind of like implemented on the ground, but it can be used as a tool for thinking through a policy issue that's very salient in the African context. So, for instance, you take, for example, a lot of African countries have fertilizer input subsidy programs. They haven't been always effectively targeted to enhance ag productivity, but also, have encouraged sometimes overproduction of cereals that are not encouraging dietary diversity and may have some environmental costs as well. So if your issue is maybe how do you repurpose or reform input subsidy programs so that they can have that dietary diversity or environmental resilience context, you'd start out thinking exactly as we did, what are the costs and benefits of the reform? Is this really kind of an interest trade-off, which I think in this case it would be, versus kind of a value trade-off? You would think about what are the coalitions that need to be aligned. Are there kind of large-scale farmers organizations that would push back? Are there smallholders that would benefit, but they're not really organized very well? So how could you create those kind of coalitions for reform? And then, thinking through that third element, how would you need to kind of design this in a way that you're not going to be creating opponents to the reform? How could you maybe package or bundle the input subsidy options together? Yeah, and then in this context, I don't think the adaptation component would be relevant. But I think you could think about, how would there be kind of new incentive structures that may be created if you actually implemented a revised input subsidy program on the ground? So I think in general, taking issues that are quite salient across the continent on narrow policy instruments, you could think through the different dimensions of it.
Great, thank you. Tanya Zerbian has a question. Everyone has said thank you for your excellent presentation or wonderful presentation, Danielle. So just to reiterate that, but Tanya asks, she basically says, would transformation significantly different from transition?
Yeah, I think transformation has the implication of some type of value added. So transition's kind of a change from one thing to the other, but the transformation is that change is actually adding some type of value. And I think even if we have challenges in operationalizing what we mean by food system transformation, I think we implicitly have this expectation of kind of adding value to our food systems so that they're not just sustaining us and providing the nutrients, but they're meeting all those other objectives that I was talking about earlier, healthy diets, resilience, et cetera. So I think that conceptually that would be the main difference for me.
Great. So Martin White says, globally, we seem to have a limited palette of policies that could genuinely transform food systems. Your analysis makes me somewhat pessimistic that even the weaker policies might get implemented. Where do you think the truly powerful and transformative policies are going to come from?
Well, I mean, they have to come from all of us. I mean, I think that's what's encouraging is we've seen a huge push in this area over the last few years. I mean, this seminar is just one of a few from this week that I've attended that have been talking about this issue. And I'd encourage you, the Food System Economic Commission report that was launched on Monday did highlight a bunch. I think they had 5 key policy areas. The one I remember most clearly is of course the repurposing one, which I do think has, if we could get everything aligned, could have substantial impact, because we're always talking about $800 billion that could be repurposed. But I think, yeah, I would encourage you to look at that report to see what they had highlighted as kind of 5 big bets for transformation.
Great. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. Did you look at the political economy of global partners in building local food systems, especially since the multiple crises that we've experienced? Food supply chains and countries are increasingly looking to strengthen their own food systems to reduce dependence on imported food.
I'm not sure if global partners there is in terms of global companies or global donors or what the partners is there.
Yeah, I'm sorry, can't say. I guess it's, did you look at the political economy of global partners in building local food systems? So whether there's opportunities or there's, potential blockers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the main focus is in the book has been on transnational linkages, and has been, I think it's fair to say, mostly looking at transnational advocacy in pushing for improved local food systems. We did not look as much on the role of financial partners in doing this, or global corporate industry in working with local partners. Yeah, but as alluded to in my conclusion, the scope of analysis is just touching the surface of issues relevant. So I think that would certainly be a key issue to take forward in further political economy work.
Great. So Rachel Headings says, fantastic presentation. It was really interesting to hear you discuss normative values. Do you believe that there is a need or place for normative food value research on the agenda for food policy research and the political economy of food research? And if so, which aspect of normative food values do you believe would be most important to understand in terms of actually achieving food system transformation?
Well, I think we already have a lot of normative values in the food system. And I think what's most valuable is to push forward a bit what those mean and how they can be meaningful for the communities that are pushing them forward. So, for example, the right to food and food sovereignty. I think, these have been around for a long time, but they continue to kind of gain resonance. And I feel like they're kind of on the ascendance again in some of the discourse about food systems and some of the disappointment with the Food System Summit. And so, if you think about something like the right to food, what does that concretely mean? We have a lot of countries that have this, even as an explicit provision in their constitutions, but there's no kind of legal means for communities to act on that, and there's not much evidence that governments know how they would respond if they were actually taken to court for not providing a right to food. So I think that's a really powerful element or value in discourses around food systems. It's the 20th anniversary of the FAO's voluntary guidelines on the right to food. And I think it's kind of a proper time to really investigate what this means and how it's been misused. We've even seen food corporations in Mexico, saying you shouldn't be putting taxes on ultra-processed foods or sugar-sweetened beverages because you're alienating people's right to food, their right to make their decisions about their food choices. So thinking through, this idea of positive and negative rights and what it means for our access to the food system. And by the same vein, I think the food sovereignty movement is hindered a little bit by not being very clear about the policy options that they want. And I think that could be kind of a fruitful area to be working more with civil society and advocates to help them refine what they actually mean by food sovereignty.
Mhm. Great, thanks. So question from an anonymous attendee. We talk frequently about compensating farmers for losses from policy, but have you seen it broached anywhere compensating large multinationals? Seems quite unpalatable, but it would be worth it if it would bring them to the negotiating table.
Yeah, I don't personally know off the top of my head. It's possible, it's feasible that has happened, and others who are attending may have examples. That is certainly something to think about. It does seem that it may not, it may. We're talking about values that maybe you shouldn't be compensating large companies that may have kind of biased our health or environment in negative ways. But sometimes you do need to get momentum, sometimes you do need to kind of compensate the losers in order to benefit a much larger set of winners.
Great, thank you. We've got just a couple more questions, so we're a little bit over, but we're going to keep going because there's so much interest. So Andrea Zick said, are there concrete assessments on corporate commitments and their progress against the SDGs?
I'm probably not best placed to answer this. I do know some efforts that have been made in terms of getting corporate pledges towards certain goals that are linked to the SDGs. And I think Lawrence Haddad has showcased some examples of this and GAIN as well. But I don't know off the top of my head, what some of those initiatives would be. But I do feel like there is there's growing awareness of corporations and industries that it's good, whether it's PR or whether it's actual belief that this is good for kind of corporate social responsibility. Making pledges and making them public online to different SDGs or other goals we think are important for development. I see that as becoming a bigger trend. And yeah, again, I don't know kind of what the actual motivation is behind it, but I think it's an important trend for transparency.
Great. Francois Stepman said, how would you integrate food systems transformation progress in the CAADP progress indicators?
Okay, I think he's referring to the African Union's Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program. Well, I think they're actually already for their next biannual, I think their fourth round of transformation scorecards. I think they're already moving towards thinking about food systems transformation rather than just agriculture. And I think it would be thinking more about, outcome variables that are not just how much our government's spending on the agricultural sector, which was a key one coming out of the Maputo targets, but things about, dietary diversity. Can we get measures on that? Greenhouse gas emissions coming from the agricultural sector. And there's several other indicators that have come out of a project called the Food Systems Countdown Initiative that I've been a part of. It's been led by Jess Fanso and others. And there has been some discussion about how to link up with the African Union to use some of those indicators. So if you have time, have a look at that Food Systems Countdown Initiative project to get a sense of indicators that could be incorporated into CAADP.
Great, thank you. So William Vorley says transformation is usually perceived as change, but should surely also include defense of what's working to provide low-income people with low-cost, nutritious food and jobs, often despite government policy, NGO projects, or donors. Would you agree?
Yeah, actually, I think that's a really novel way to think about it. We're constantly saying that, constantly saying our food system is broken and it's not working, but actually there may be important things that are working and we shouldn't be advocating to change. So I think that's a unique kind of perspective on it, that we should be defending what's working and better understanding what's working, having some type of inventory of what's working. It's not.
Great, thank you. We'll go for one last question from Heather Alford. And she asks, how do we make more visible that we're being influenced by the current set of policies, incentives, environments, rather than the current view that we have to use our choice and that will change, and that creating change to policies is limiting our choice in food systems?
I'm not sure I fully understand. I wonder if you can
let me
repeat it one more
repeat
time.
that. So she says, how do we make more visible that we're being influenced with the current set of policies, incentives, environments, rather than the current view, which is that we have citizens have a choice, and that actually current policies are limiting that choice in food systems?
Okay, so I guess the takeaway is kind of there's an implication now that citizens do have choice, but actually we're confined by all these other types of regulations and incentive structures.
So the feeling is that the pitch being citizens have choice, which is the current narrative, and we should be able to use that choice and freedom within the food system. But actually, and that any change to policies like sugar sweetened beverages tax limits that choice to some extent. And what she's saying is, how do we change the narrative to actually show that the current environment, current policies are by default shaping our choices?
Yeah, I mean, I again, I think that comes down to communication. I mean, I'm not sure like a proper advocacy strategy to do that. But I mean, I think the kind of example I gave about, companies are being very good at kind of shifting the rights discourse, saying that these types of things are limiting consumer rights. I think consumers can be just as effective in saying that the current kind of structure and architecture of the global food system has in effect, limited our choices in some ways. And we may not have as much choice as you're saying. So I think it's really a kind of communication framing. I cannot say off the top of my head what kind of advocacy technique could be used to overcome that, besides being vocal about it in various venues.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Danielle. I'm really sorry, everyone. We're going to leave it there. We've gone over by 10 minutes because there's been so much interest in your presentation. Thank you again very, very much. We will all read your book and the article in Nature Food with much interest and take away the nuggets that you've given us for both policy practice and for research. So thank you so much. Please, everyone, do join in on the 22nd of February when we've got Emeritus Professor Tim Lang presenting. So Danielle, thank you very, very much. That was an excellent presentation, and we reached over 160 people in the audience. So thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity and the very thought-provoking questions. A lot of food for thought. So I guess that's the point of the Food Thinkers webinar.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.